She stood outside that closed door on her wedding night, her hand pressed flat against the wood, listening to a woman laugh on the other side, a laugh that wasn't hers. Isabella Hartley had walked into this marriage with her eyes open. She had not expected love, but she had not expected this. She pressed her fingers harder against the door, breathed once, breathed twice, and made herself a promise that would change everything. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who should have protected you, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel. Follow this story all the way to the end and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The summer of 1815 sat heavy over Lancaster Manor like a fever that wouldn't break. The kind of heat that made the air shimmer and the fields go gold at the edges before their time. The kind of heat that made people say things they meant and do things they couldn't take back. Isabella Hartley arrived at the chapel in a silk gown, the color of winter cream, stitched through with seed pearls her mother had sewn in by hand over 6 months of candlelight. 6 months of hope. 6 months of telling herself that a practical arrangement could still be a dignified one. That a woman could walk into a marriage of convenience with her head held high and walk out of it someday with her soul still intact. She told herself that on the carriage ride over. She was still telling herself that when she took Gideon Lancaster's arm at the altar. He did not look at her when she arrived. He was speaking in low tones to a man on his left. Something about a shipment. Something about a letter from Baltimore. And he finished the sentence before he turned to acknowledge her. His eyes moved over her the way a man's eyes move over a piece of property he has already decided the value of. Efficient. Calculating. Done. "You look well," he said. "Not beautiful, not lovely. Well, the way you might compliment a horse before a long ride." "Thank you," Isabella said, because she had been raised to say thank you, and because she was not yet ready to say anything else. The ceremony was brief. The Reverend spoke of union and duty and the providence of God. And Gideon Lancaster stood beside her as still and cold as a marble column. His hand when he took hers for the ring was dry and firm. Not unkind, just absent, like his mind was already somewhere else entirely. When he kissed her, the obligatory press of lips that satisfied the watching crowd, she felt nothing from him. Not warmth, not hesitation, not even discomfort. Just the mechanical completion of a social requirement. And then he was already pulling back, already half-turned toward the guests, filing forward to offer congratulations. The chapel was full of people who knew the Hartley name and the Lancaster fortune, and who had spent the last 3 weeks calculating what the merger of the two might mean for their own prospects. Isabella could hear them murmuring behind their fans and their gloves, the women appraising her gown, the men already talking about the Lancaster shipping contracts. She was decoration. She was a transaction. She understood that. She had understood it when her father came to her 6 months ago with hat in hand and shame in his eyes, and told her that the Hartley tobacco lands were mortgaged 3 times over, that the creditors were circling that Gideon Lancaster had made an offer, not a romantic offer, a business offer, and that her answer would determine whether the family kept its land or lost everything by winter. She had said yes. She had said yes because she loved her father and because she was 24 years old and clear-eyed enough to know that love was not the only thing worth protecting in this world. But she had not said yes to humiliation. That distinction, she understood now, was going to matter a great deal. Chug. The wedding supper was held in the great dining room of Lancaster Manor, a long table set with silver and crystal, and more candles than Isabella had ever seen burning at once. The guests were the elite of Virginia's social circuit landowners, merchants, 2 state legislators, and a scattering of women whose primary occupation was the management of other people's reputations. Isabella sat at the far end of the table from Gideon, which she suspected was not an accident, and she worked the room the way her mother had taught her, graciously patiently asking questions rather than making statements, remembering every name she was given. "You seem very composed for a bride," said the woman to her left. Lady Margaret Crane. Isabella knew the name before the introduction. She'd been warned about Lady Margaret by her cousin Eliza the week before. Watch that one. She's been after Lancaster for 3 years, and she's not the kind to let go gracefully. I find composure useful in most situations, Isabella said pleasantly. Lady Margaret smiled. It was the kind of smile that had teeth behind it. I imagine it must be. Gideon does run a rather demanding household. I do hope you're prepared for it. I imagine I'll learn quickly. Yes. Lady Margaret let the word sit for a moment. You will. Across the table, a man Isabella didn't recognize leaned over to speak to Gideon, and Gideon laughed a real laugh, the first genuine expression she'd seen from him all day, and clapped the man on the shoulder. He did not look down the table toward his wife. Isabella cut her roast with steady hands and told herself it didn't matter. She had not come here for his attention. She had come here to secure a future. Those were two different things, and she needed to keep them separate in her mind. She was still telling herself that when Mrs. Caldwell the housekeeper appeared quietly at her elbow near the end of the supper and said in a voice low enough that only Isabella could hear, "Mrs. Lancaster, I wonder if I might have a brief word with you before the evening is much further along." Mrs. Caldwell was perhaps 60, with silver-threaded hair and the kind of face that had seen enough of life not to be alarmed by most of it. Her eyes, though her eyes were carrying something careful and deliberate, something she had clearly decided Isabella needed to know. Isabella set down her fork. Of course. They stepped into the corridor, just off the dining room, close enough that Isabella could still hear the murmur of conversation from the table, far enough that no one would notice them. "I've served this house for 22 years, Mrs. Caldwell said without preamble. "I served Gideon Lancaster's father, and I've served Gideon Lancaster. I am not a woman who carries tales or makes trouble where none exists." "I believe you," Isabella said. "Then believe me when I tell you this." Mrs. Caldwell folded her hands in front of her with the practiced dignity of a woman who had learned long ago how to deliver hard news without flinching. "There is a woman in this house tonight who should not be here. She arrived this afternoon while preparations for the supper were underway. She was brought in through the East Passage. Her name is Cecily Vane. She has been a regular visitor for the past 2 years." The corridor was very quiet. Isabella could hear her own heartbeat. "Is she a guest?" Isabella asked, though she already knew she wasn't. "She has been given the room at the end of the east wing." Mrs. Caldwell's voice did not waver. "The room adjacent to Mr. Lancaster's private chamber." The corridor was very quiet for a long moment. Then Isabella said, "Thank you, Mrs. Caldwell. I thought you should know." The housekeeper paused. "What you do with that knowledge is your affair, Mrs. Lancaster. But I have served enough women in this house to know that ignorance never protected any of them. Knowledge might." "You're right," Isabella said. "It might." She walked back into the dining room. She sat down in her chair. She picked up her fork. She finished her supper. No one at that table would have known that anything had changed. Chag. The guests departed in stages. The evening wound down the way those evenings always did, slowly, then all at once. Gideon played the gracious host at the door, accepting congratulations with a kind of professional warmth he had not managed to produce during the ceremony itself, and Isabella stood beside him and smiled and said the right things and touched his arm at the appropriate moments, because that was what the evening required of her. When the last carriage rolled down the drive, he stepped back inside and let a footman close the door, and he turned to her with the same efficient look he'd had at the altar. "You conducted yourself well tonight," he said. "I'm glad you noticed." He studied her for a moment. There was something in his expression she couldn't quite read, not suspicion exactly, but an awareness, like he was revising something. "I keep unusual hours," he said. "I won't expect you to adjust your routine to accommodate mine." "That's thoughtful of you." "My study is at the end of the west corridor. I would ask that you don't enter it without prior arrangement." "And the east wing," Isabella said. The silence lasted exactly 2 seconds. "The east wing is used for guest accommodation," he said. His voice was level. "The rooms are kept prepared." "Of course they are." She met his eyes, held them, did not look away. "Good night, Mr. Lancaster." She went upstairs. She found the door to his private chamber at 10 minutes past 11. She had not gone there intentionally, or rather, she had told herself she wasn't going there intentionally, which was not the same thing. She had walked the East Wing corridor on the pretense of getting her bearings in an unfamiliar house, and she had stopped because the light under the door at the far end was warm, and there was a sound behind it she recognized in some deep animal way before her mind caught up with what she was hearing. Laughter. A woman's laughter. Low and proprietary, the kind that came from a woman who was comfortable in a space, who had been comfortable in that space many times before. And then a man's voice, Gideon's voice, with a softness in it she had not heard once that entire day. Isabella stood in the corridor and pressed her hand flat against the cold plaster wall beside the door and breathed. In, out. She did not cry. She had not come into this house with romantic expectations, and so there was no romance to grieve. But there was something that lived below the practical arrangements and the clear-eyed bargains, something that had quietly hoped without her permission that the man she'd married might have had the basic decency to wait one single night. One night. 24 hours. That was all she'd needed from him. Just the bare minimum of dignity. He hadn't given it. She stood there long enough to make sure she felt all of it. The anger and the humiliation and the particular cold clarity that follows both of those things when you are a woman who refuses to be destroyed by them. And then she straightened her spine and walked back to her own chamber and sat down at the small writing desk by the window. She did not sleep. What she did instead was think. By the time the household began to stir at dawn, Isabella had made a list. It was not an emotional list. It was not a list of grievances or complaints or wounded feelings. It was a practical list, the kind a woman makes when she understands that her situation is a problem that requires a solution, not a sorrow that requires a witness. She needed to understand the estate's finances, not the version of the finances Gideon had presented to her father during the negotiations, the polished version, the acceptable version, but the real version, the ledgers, the debts, the contracts. She needed to know what Lancaster Manor actually owed, and to whom, because a man who hid a mistress behind his wife's back on his wedding night was capable of hiding other things too. She needed allies. Mrs. Caldwell was one. She would need others among the staff, among the tenants, among the social circle she'd been introduced to at the supper. Lady Margaret Crane was not an ally, not yet, and possibly not ever. But she was a source of information. And in this house, Isabella was beginning to understand. Information was the only currency that mattered. And she needed time. Not much of it. She was not a patient woman by temperament, though she had learned patience the way you learn to walk after an injury, because the alternative was worse, but enough. Enough to move carefully. Enough to build something solid before she challenged anything. She heard footsteps in the corridor. Light, quick footsteps, a housemaid probably starting the morning rounds. Isabella stood, went to the door, and opened it. The girl, 16 at most, with a startled expression and a pile of fresh linens in her arms, stopped short. "Good morning," Isabella said. "What's your name?" "Mary, ma'am." The girl bobbed a curtsy, nearly dropping the linens. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Lancaster, I didn't expect—" "Don't apologize. I wanted to ask you who manages the household accounts. Is that Mrs. Caldwell's responsibility, or does Mr. Lancaster handle it directly?" Mary blinked. "Mrs. Caldwell keeps the household accounts, ma'am. The estate ledgers are kept in Mr. Lancaster's study." "And the estate ledgers, are they reviewed regularly by anyone besides Mr. Lancaster?" I don't know, ma'am. I'm sorry." "That's all right, Mary. You've been very helpful." Isabella stepped back. "Carry on." She closed the door and added a line to her list. "Access the estate ledgers." Breakfast was served at 8. Gideon Lancaster came to the table at 8:15, looking exactly as he always looked, composed, clean, undisturbed by anything as inconvenient as conscience. He sat down across from Isabella and accepted his coffee and opened a letter that had arrived with the morning post. Isabella buttered her bread and watched him read. "I'd like to meet with the estate steward this week," she said. He looked up. "Pardon. The estate steward. I'd like to introduce myself and understand how the property is managed. It seems appropriate given my position." Gideon set down his letter. He looked at her with that same reassessing expression she'd caught the night before. Recalculating, adjusting, deciding how to respond to something he hadn't accounted for. "The estate management is my concern," he said. "You needn't trouble yourself with it." "I don't consider it a trouble. I consider it a responsibility. Isabella." "I managed my father's household accounts for 4 years," she said, "and his crop records for 2 before that, when his eyes began to fail him. I'm not unfamiliar with the work." She picked up her coffee. "I'm not asking to replace anyone. I'm asking to be informed. There's a difference." He watched her for a moment. Something moved behind his eyes, she couldn't name it. Not quite respect. Not quite irritation. Something in between. "I'll arrange an introduction," he said finally, "at the end of the week." "Thank you." She set down her cup. "I also noticed that 2 of the fence lines on the south approach appear to be in need of repair. I'd like to understand whether that's been scheduled or whether it's been overlooked." Gideon Lancaster said nothing for a moment. Then slowly he picked up his letter again. "I'll look into it," he said. Isabella finished her breakfast and decided that this was a start. Not a victory. Not even close to a victory. But the first small stone laid in a very long road. And she was a woman who knew how to build things one stone at a time. Outside the dining room window, Lancaster Manor spread out in the morning heat. The fields and the outbuildings, and the long drive lined with old oaks, and it looked exactly like what it was, a prize, a possession, a thing of significant and carefully maintained value. Isabella Hartley looked at it and thought, "Mine. Not yet. But someday." She was going to make absolutely sure of it. The end of the week came, and Gideon Lancaster did not arrange the introduction to the estate steward. Isabella waited. She was good at waiting. She had learned it, the same way she'd learned everything useful in her life out of necessity rather than inclination. She waited 3 days past the day he'd promised, and when he offered no explanation and no apology, she went and found the steward herself. His name was Mr. Horace Webb, and he was a thin, nervous man of about 50, who kept his office in a converted outbuilding behind the main stable. She found him bent over a ledger with a quill in his hand, and the expression on his face when she appeared in his doorway was the expression of a man who had been hoping very hard that this particular conversation would never happen. "Mrs. Lancaster," he said, standing so abruptly that he knocked the ledger half off the desk and had to grab it. "I wasn't that. Is Mr. Lancaster didn't mention—" "Mr. Lancaster has been very busy," Isabella said pleasantly. "I thought I'd introduce myself rather than wait any longer. I hope that's not inconvenient." "No, ma'am, of course not." He set the ledger down and smoothed his coat and tried to look like a man who had nothing to hide. He was not entirely successful. "What can I do for you?" "You can sit down," she said, and sat down herself in the chair across from his desk. "And you can tell me honestly how the estate is running." Mr. Webb sat. He looked at his hands. He looked at the ledger. He looked at Isabella with the eyes of a man standing at a crossroads he hadn't expected to reach. "The estate is running," he said carefully, "within its present means." "That's a diplomatic answer." "It's an honest one, ma'am." "Then let me ask a less diplomatic question." She folded her hands in her lap. "Are we solvent?" The silence lasted long enough to tell her everything she needed to know before he even opened his mouth. "There are certain obligations," Mr. Webb said. "Loans taken out over the last several years, against the projected income from the shipping contracts. The contracts have been slower to produce than anticipated." "How much slower?" He looked at the ledger again. "Mr. Webb," Isabella said, and her voice was gentle but absolutely firm. "I am the mistress of this estate. Whatever is in that ledger affects me as much as it affects anyone in this house. I need the truth." He opened the ledger. He turned it toward her. He pointed to a column of figures with the resigned expression of a man confessing to a priest. Isabella looked at the numbers. She didn't react. She had trained herself over the course of that long sleepless wedding night not to react to things that were designed to knock her sideways. She looked at the figures the way a doctor looks at a wound clinically, with full attention without flinching. The debt was significant. Not ruinous, not yet, but significant, and more than that, it was structured badly. Multiple creditors, overlapping interest schedules, the kind of financial architecture that had been built not by a man with a plan, but by a man trying to buy time. "When does the next payment fall due?" she asked. "October, ma'am. To a merchant house in Baltimore. $1,200. And the income from the shipping contracts between now and October. Perhaps $400 if the summer routes perform as expected. Which leaves a shortfall of $800. "Yes, ma'am." Isabella closed the ledger. "Thank you, Mr. Webb," she said. "I appreciate your candor. I'd ask that you not mention this conversation to Mr. Lancaster until I've had a chance to speak with him myself." The steward nodded with the grateful expression of a man who had just handed a very heavy burden to someone better equipped to carry it. "Of course, Mrs. Lancaster." She walked back to the house with $800 worth of problem turning quietly in her mind, and she thought about her father's tobacco lands, and she thought about the shipping routes she'd overheard the merchants discussing at the wedding supper, and she thought about a letter she'd received 2 weeks before the wedding from her cousin's husband in Philadelphia, who ran a successful import business, and had mentioned almost in passing that the Eastern Virginia routes were badly underserved. She thought about all of that, and by the time she reached the house, she was already working on a solution. She did not go to Gideon, not yet, not until she had something more than a problem to bring him. Lady Margaret Crane came to call on a Tuesday afternoon with a basket of preserves and the particular energy of a woman who has come to gather information under the guise of neighborliness. Isabella received her in the front parlor with tea and her most agreeable expression. She had been expecting this visit for a week. She'd been ready for it since the wedding supper. "You've settled in quickly," Lady Margaret observed, looking around with the careful eyes of a woman cataloging everything she saw. "Gideon must be pleased." "I couldn't say. He's been very occupied with business." "Yes, he always is." Lady Margaret accepted her tea with a smile that contained several layers of meaning. "It can be lonely being the wife of a man whose attention is divided. I find I keep myself quite occupied," Isabella said. "There's always something that wants doing in a house this size." "I imagine so." Lady Margaret set down her cup. "I must say I admire your composure, Mrs. Lancaster. Truly. Coming into a household like this with it takes a certain kind of woman to manage it gracefully." "What kind of woman do you think that is?" Isabella asked. The question landed differently than Lady Margaret had expected. She blinked, recalibrated, and then smiled the smile with teeth in it. "A practical one," she said. "Then I suppose I'm exactly the right woman for the position." Isabella refilled Lady Margaret's cup without being asked. "Tell me, Lady Margaret, you've known the Lancaster family for some time. What is your impression of the shipping interests Gideon mentioned? Some difficulty with the Baltimore routes. And I was wondering whether the local opinion runs similarly, or whether it's a concern particular to this estate." Lady Margaret stared at her. It was not the conversation she had come prepared for, and it showed. "The shipping interests are not something I follow particularly closely," she said. "No, of course not. I only ask because I'm trying to form a complete picture of the regional economy. My father always said that a woman who understands money understands everything else." Isabella smiled pleasantly. "More preserves." Lady Margaret left 40 minutes later with considerably less information than she'd arrived hoping to collect, and Isabella stood at the window and watched the carriage go with a quiet satisfaction that she kept entirely off her face until it was safely out of sight. Mrs. Caldwell appeared at her shoulder. "She'll be back," the housekeeper said. "I know." Isabella turned from the window. "Good. Let her come. Every time she does, I learn something." Mrs. Caldwell studied her for a moment, with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was heading in that direction. "Your predecessor," she said carefully, "the late Mrs. Lancaster, Gideon's mother. She was a great deal like you, not in appearance, but in here." She touched her own sternum briefly. She ran this house for 30 years, and no one ever saw the seams. What happened to her? She died tired, Mrs. Caldwell said simply. But she died with the house intact, and her children provided for, and she considered that a victory worth having. Isabella nodded slowly. That's either a very encouraging story, or a very sobering one. Most true stories are both, ma'am. It was Mrs. Caldwell who told her about the tenant situation. Not directly, the housekeeper chose her moments carefully, and she delivered information the way a careful gardener delivers water in the right amount at the right time. She mentioned, apparently in passing, that 2 of the tenant farming families on the eastern boundary of the estate had not received the seed supplies they'd been promised in the spring. That the well servicing their section of land had been deteriorating for 2 seasons. That when they'd brought these concerns to Mr. Webb, he'd been sympathetic but helpless, and when Webb had brought them to Gideon, the response had been delayed. How delayed? Isabella asked. The seed request was made in March, Mrs. Caldwell said. It is now July. Isabella was silent for a moment. Who are the families? The Holloways and the Coopers. Both been on this land for 20 years. Both good people. Both patient so far. But patience has a bottom. Mrs. Lancaster and I believe they are close to it. Isabella went to see them the next morning. She did not ask Gideon's permission. She did not mention her plans at breakfast. She asked for a horse to be saddled and rode out with only Mary, the young housemaid, who turned out to be the daughter of one of the grooms, and knew every inch of the estate's back roads by instinct. The Holloway family received her with the careful, guarded courtesy of people who had learned not to expect too much from the main house. The father, Thomas Holloway, was a weathered man in his 40s, with steady hands and steady eyes, and he looked at Isabella the way men like him always looked at women from big houses, with a fundamental skepticism that was not unkind, just well-earned. Mrs. Lancaster, he said, and there was a flicker of something in his expression at the name, an awareness maybe of what it might mean that she had come herself, rather than sending a man with a message. This is unexpected. I expect it is, Isabella said. I wanted to come and introduce myself. And I wanted to ask directly what you need from this estate that you haven't been getting. The flicker became something more substantial. His wife, standing in the doorway behind him, made a small sound that wasn't quite a word. Thomas Holloway looked at Isabella for a long moment, measuring her the way a man measures something he isn't sure he can trust, but might need to. The seed was promised in March, he said. My west field went in half planted. That's a season's income, Mrs. Lancaster. That's my children's winter. The seed will be there by the end of this week, Isabella said. I'll arrange it personally. And the well needs new timber at the collar and the ropes rotted through. I can fix it myself if someone provides the materials. I'll have Mr. Webb arrange the materials tomorrow, with payment for your labor. Thomas Holloway was quiet for a moment. His wife had come fully into the doorway now, and she was watching Isabella with an expression that was somewhere between hope and self-protection. You're not what we expected, Holloway said finally. I get that feeling often, Isabella said. I'm going to try to be useful to this estate and to the people on it. I'd appreciate the same in return. Not loyalty, I haven't earned that yet. Just honesty. She rode away from the Holloways and then the Coopers, and by the time she got back to the main house, she had a list of 6 additional supply requests that had gone unanswered. 2 maintenance complaints that had never been formally recorded, and the beginnings of something she recognized as trust, careful and conditional and entirely worth cultivating. She walked into the house and nearly ran directly into Gideon. He was standing in the entrance hall with his coat on and his hat in his hand, and he looked at her, at the dust on her riding dress, at the color in her face from the heat, and the riding with an expression she had not seen on him before. It was not quite anger. It was not quite surprise. It was the expression of a man who has miscalculated something and is only now becoming aware of the fact. Where have you been? He said. Visiting the tenant families on the eastern boundary, she said, and walked past him toward the stairs. The Holloways and the Coopers. Did you know that their seed supplies from March were never delivered? Isabella. The Holloways' west field went in half planted. That's a significant income loss for a family that's been farming your land loyally for 20 years. She stopped at the foot of the stairs and turned to face him. "I've told Mr. Webb to arrange the seed delivery by end of week and to authorize the well repair materials for Mr. Holloway. I assumed you'd want that handled promptly." Gideon Lancaster looked at her. The miscalculation was doing visible work behind his eyes. "You didn't consult me," he said. "You weren't available," she said, "and it was urgent. The families needed to hear from someone that the estate hadn't forgotten them." She held his gaze. "I thought it was better to act than to wait." "The estate management," he said, and his voice had developed an edge, "is my responsibility." "Then I suggest you manage it," Isabella said, "because the Holloways and the Coopers are not the only families waiting. There are 6 more requests in the estate record that have gone without response for over a month. I can give you the list if that would help." The silence stretched between them like a rope pulled tight. "You went through the estate records," Gideon said. "I spoke with Mr. Webb." She tilted her head very slightly, "which I told you I intended to do, at the end of last week." He hadn't arranged the introduction. They both knew it. The fact sat between them, and Isabella watched him decide what to do with it. "Fine," he said finally. The word was not gracious, but it was a word, and it was the right one. "Give me the list." She reached into her pocket and handed him the paper she'd written that morning. He looked at it. His expression changed, not much, not dramatically, but enough. "When did you compile this?" he asked. "Yesterday evening." She turned to go upstairs. "The tenant situation needs attention, Gideon. Before harvest, not after." She was 3 steps up when he said her name. "Isabella." She stopped, turned halfway. "The seed will be delivered Thursday," he said. "I'll speak to Webb myself." "I know you will," she said. "Thank you." She went upstairs, and she did not smile until she was safely behind her own closed door. The social call she'd been dreading came on a Friday, in the form of a formal dinner invitation from the Ashworths, one of the most prominent families in the county, with the kind of social authority that could either validate or obliterate a new wife's standing, depending on how the evening went. The invitation was addressed to both Lancaster and his wife, which was either a courtesy or a test, and Isabella suspected it was both. Gideon told her about it at breakfast. "The Ashworths have invited us for Saturday evening," he said, not looking up from his correspondence. "It would be appropriate to attend." "Of course," Isabella said. "What should I know about them before we go?" He looked up. The question had surprised him again. She was developing a habit of that. "What do you mean?" "I mean what matters to them. What are their interests, their concerns, their particular social sensitivities? I'd rather understand the room before I'm standing in it." He set down his letter and regarded her with the expression she was beginning to recognize as his version of genuine attention, still guarded, still controlled but present in a way he usually wasn't. "Edmund Ashworth is primarily interested in land and water rights," he said. "He's been in a quiet dispute with 3 neighboring families over the creek boundary for 2 years. His wife Constance is a woman of firm opinions and strong religious convictions. She is not unkind, but she will form her opinion of you within the first 5 minutes and change it rarely afterward. And their children, 2 sons, both working the land. One daughter recently engaged to a man from Richmond, whose family's reputation is debated. So Constance Ashworth is anxious about the daughter's match and would welcome distraction from her own social anxieties." Gideon blinked. "I wouldn't have put it that way." "I would." Isabella stood and smoothed her skirt. "Thank you. That's useful." She turned to leave, and then Gideon said, and this was the first time he'd said anything that wasn't either a correction or a directive, "You're not what I expected." She stopped. She did not turn around immediately. She let the words sit for a moment, let herself feel the shape of them. Then she turned to face him. "What did you expect?" He looked at her steadily. "Someone quieter." "Most people do," she said. "They're usually wrong." She walked out of the dining room, and behind her she heard very faintly, barely there at all, the sound of Gideon Lancaster exhaling slowly, like a man releasing a breath he'd been holding for longer than he realized. The Ashworth dinner was on a Saturday, and everything went exactly as Isabella had calculated it would go, right up until the moment it didn't. She handled Constance Ashworth with the careful precision of a woman diffusing something delicate, asked her about the upcoming Richmond engagement. Within the first 3 minutes, listened with genuine attention, while the older woman unburdened herself of 6 months' worth of maternal anxiety, offered 2 observations that were sympathetic without being patronizing, and watched Constance's opinion of her shift from guarded assessment to cautious approval in the space of 1/4 hour. Edmund Ashworth turned out to be exactly as Gideon had described, direct, land-obsessed, and not especially interested in conversation that didn't involve property boundaries. Isabella asked him one precise question about the creek dispute, used the right legal terminology. She'd spent 2 evenings with a law pamphlet she'd found in Gideon's library, and watched his expression go from polite indifference to startled respect. "Where'd you learn about water rights law?" he asked. "My father's lands had 3 contested boundaries," she said. "You learn quickly when the alternative is losing your farm." Ha! Edmund Ashworth looked at Gideon. "She's something your wife." Gideon said yes, and Isabella caught from across the table the slight adjustment in his expression. Not pride exactly. Something more complicated. Something he hadn't quite decided how to classify yet. It was going well? Better than well. Isabella was refilling her water glass and beginning to think that Saturday nights in Virginia might actually become manageable when she looked up and saw the woman who had just been shown into the Ashworth's front parlor across the room. Cecily Vane. She was beautiful. Isabella had known she would be. Tall and dark-haired, with the kind of easy, comfortable beauty that came from a woman who had never been required to work very hard for the attention she received. She was on the arm of a man Isabella didn't recognize, older, florid-faced, prosperous-looking, and she was smiling and laughing, and looking entirely at home in the Ashworth's parlor. She looked at Gideon, and Gideon looked at her. It lasted only 2 seconds. Maybe 3. The kind of look that a man and a woman who know each other in certain ways exchange when they find themselves in the same room unexpectedly, a micro-conversation conducted entirely in eye contact, containing things that could not be said aloud. Isabella saw all of it. She set down her water glass. She smoothed her napkin. She turned to Constance Ashworth and said very calmly, "Your centerpiece is beautiful. Are those from your own garden?" And Constance Ashworth, entirely oblivious to the earthquake that had just registered only on Isabella's internal instruments, said yes. The roses had been her mother's. She'd kept the same rootstock for 30 years. Wasn't that something? And Isabella agreed that yes, it certainly was. And she smiled, and she kept her eyes off Gideon Lancaster for the rest of the dinner because she didn't need to look at him again to know what she'd already seen. He had not expected Cecily to be there, but he had not been unhappy about it either. Isabella drove home in the carriage with Gideon beside her, and neither of them spoke for the first several minutes, and then Gideon said, "Constance Ashworth asked me twice if you'd be willing to serve on her charitable committee." "I know," Isabella said. "I told her I'd consider it. She doesn't ask twice unless she's serious about wanting someone." "I know that too." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "You played that evening very skillfully." "I wasn't playing," Isabella said. "I was working. There's a difference." Another silence. The carriage rocked gently on the summer road. "Cecily Vane is the daughter of a business associate," Gideon said. Her presence at the Ashworth's dinner was unexpected. Isabella did not look at him. She looked out the carriage window at the dark Virginia countryside rolling past the fireflies just beginning to come up in the fields. "You don't need to explain her to me," she said. "I'm not explaining, He stopped. "You're telling me a version of the truth," Isabella said quietly. "That you've decided I can manage. I appreciate the consideration, but I'd rather you not bother." She turned to look at him, then, and she made sure her expression was entirely composed, entirely calm, because she needed him to understand that she was not going to break. Not in front of him. Not here. "What I need from you is not an account of your personal arrangements. What I need from you is a functional partnership in the running of this estate. That's the agreement we made. I intend to honor it. I expect the same from you. From Gideon Lancaster was very still. And the rest? He asked. His voice was careful, like he was asking about something larger than the two of them. The rest, Isabella said, is your business. She turned back to the window. She did not say, but the day is coming when it will become mine. She did not say, I am not the woman you thought you were marrying, and you are only beginning to understand what that means. She did not say, I have spent 6 weeks in your house, learning every fault line in its foundation, and when I am ready, I will know exactly where to stand. She just looked at the fireflies rising in the summer dark, and kept every word of it to herself. For now, the seed arrived at the Holloway farm on Thursday as promised. Isabella knew because Thomas Holloway sent his eldest son to the main house with a handwritten note, careful formal letters from a man who hadn't expected to need them, that said simply, received in full. Thank you, Mrs. Lancaster. She folded the note and put it in the small cedar box she kept on her writing desk next to the list she'd made on her wedding night. She was building something in that box. Evidence, maybe. Or just a record of what was possible when someone paid attention. Gideon saw the note before she put it away. He didn't comment on it, but she caught him looking at it with an expression she couldn't fully read, and that unreadable expression stayed with her longer than she expected. She didn't have time to think about it for long because 3 days after the Ashworth dinner, the letter arrived from Baltimore. She didn't see it first. Mr. Webb did, and he brought it to her rather than to Gideon, a choice that told her more about how the household power had shifted in 8 weeks than any direct conversation could have. He knocked on the door of the small sitting room she'd appropriated as a working office, and he came in with the letter in his hand and an expression that had left calm behind several blocks back. This came this morning, he said, from Hargrove and Sons, the merchant house. Isabella took it. She read it once quickly, then again slowly. The Baltimore creditors were not waiting until October. They were calling in a partial payment, $400 by the 1st of August, 3 weeks away. The letter was polite in the way that letters written by lawyers are polite, technically courteous, and absolutely merciless underneath. Does Mr. Lancaster know? She asked. The letter was addressed to him, ma'am, but he's been in Richmond since Monday. He's not expected back until Friday. Isabella set the letter on her desk. She thought for exactly 30 seconds. Get me the full accounting, she said. Everything, not the summary, the actual ledgers. All of them. Mr. Webb hesitated for only a moment. Then he nodded and went. What she found in those ledgers over the next 2 days was worse than what she'd seen the first time, and the first time had already been bad enough to keep her up half a night. The shipping contracts that were supposed to generate the estate's primary income had been signed under terms that Gideon either hadn't fully understood or had understood and hoped would resolve themselves before they became a crisis. 2 of the 3 merchant partners had already quietly withdrawn, citing delays and unreliable routing. The 3rd was holding, but barely. The estate's income had been running at roughly 60% of projected levels for over a year, and Gideon had been covering the gap with loans that had their own interest schedules, which had their own deadlines, which were now beginning to arrive all at once, like a series of waves that had been building far out at sea, while everyone on shore was still looking at the horizon. She sat with all of it spread out before her, the ledgers, the contracts, the correspondence, and she did the arithmetic twice to make sure she had it right. Then she put everything back in order exactly as she'd found it, and she wrote 3 letters. The first was to her cousin's husband in Philadelphia, whose import business ran along the eastern coastal routes. She did not ask for money. She asked for information, specifically whether he knew any established merchant houses that might be interested in a renegotiated shipping contract out of the Virginia coastal ports, and whether he could facilitate a conversation before the end of the month. The second letter was to a woman named Martha Greer, whose husband had died 2 years prior and left her managing a successful dry goods trade in Fredericksburg. Isabella had met her once briefly at a social gathering before her marriage, and Martha Greer had said something in passing about the difficulty of finding reliable overland distribution that had lodged itself in the back of Isabella's mind and stayed there. The third letter was to Gideon. It was the shortest of the 3. It said, Come home Thursday. There are matters we need to discuss before Friday's creditor deadline. I have some thoughts on how to proceed. She sealed all 3 letters and sent them out with the morning post, and then went about her day as though none of it was happening, because the household still needed running, and the tenants still needed checking on, and Mrs. Caldwell had reported that the roof over the east larder was showing signs of water damage that needed to be assessed before the summer rains came. She dealt with the roof. She was standing on a chair examining the ceiling of the larder when Mary appeared in the doorway and said, "Ma'am, Lady Margaret Crane is here." Of course she was. Isabella climbed down from the chair, smoothed her dress, and went to the front parlor. Lady Margaret was already seated, and already arranging her expression into one of elaborate sympathetic concern, which was a more aggressive posture than the polished social sparring of her previous visits. Something had changed. She had information, and she had come to use it. "My dear Isabella," she said, which was the first time she'd used the given name, which meant nothing good. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all. Tea, please." Lady Margaret waited until the tea was poured and the maid had withdrawn before she leaned forward very slightly and said, "I heard something yesterday that concerned me, about the Lancaster shipping interests." Isabella kept her expression pleasant. "Oh, it's probably nothing. Rumor most likely. You know how people talk." Lady Margaret's eyes were steady and watching. "But I heard from Edmund Ashworth, who heard from someone in Baltimore, that the Hargrove house has begun making inquiries about the estate's collateral holdings." There it was, the reason for the visit. Lady Margaret had come to see whether Isabella knew, and if she did know, how she was handling it, and if she wasn't handling it, to position herself as the sympathetic confidant of a woman about to watch her marriage and her social standing collapse simultaneously. "I'm aware of the situation," Isabella said calmly. Lady Margaret blinked. "You are. I've been working with the estate steward on a resolution for the past several days. It's a manageable situation." She picked up her tea. "But I appreciate your concern." The silence that followed was the sound of Lady Margaret recalculating everything she'd come prepared to say. "Gideon told you," she said finally. And there was something raw in the question, something that wasn't purely social calculation, a genuine disbelief that Gideon Lancaster had confided in his wife. "Gideon and I discussed the estate together," Isabella said, which was not quite a lie and not quite the truth, but was exactly what needed to be said in this room, in this moment. "That's how we've arranged things." Lady Margaret looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, with a careful smile that was performing more work than usual, "Well, you are full of surprises, Mrs. Lancaster." "I've been told that," Isabella said. Gideon came home on Thursday evening, not Friday. Isabella was in her office when she heard the horse in the drive, and she took a breath, straightened the papers on her desk, and waited. He came to her directly. She could tell from the sound of his footsteps in the corridor, purposeful fast, that he'd already seen something. The letter, or web, or both. He opened the door without knocking. She had expected anger. She'd prepared for anger. What she had not quite prepared for was the particular expression on his face, which was not anger exactly, but something rawer and less controlled. Something that looked under all its layers almost like fear. "The Baltimore letter," he said. "Yes." "You saw it?" "Yes." "You went through the ledgers?" "Yes," Isabella said. "Sit down, Gideon." He didn't sit. He stood in the doorway and looked at her with that raw, unguarded expression, and she could see the exact moment he registered that she was not panicking, that the office was tidy and organized, and that she was sitting behind the desk with the posture of a woman who had a plan. "How bad is it?" he asked, and the question for the first time was honest. No deflection, no performance, just a man asking a question he'd been afraid to ask himself. "Bad enough," she said, "but not unrecoverable." She stood and turned the ledger toward him, the one she'd marked with notation over the past 2 days. "Sit down and let me show you what I found." He sat down. She talked for 40 minutes. She walked him through the income shortfall, the overlapping creditor schedules, the failed contract terms. She showed him the letter she'd drafted to her cousin's contact in Philadelphia and explained the logic of the renegotiation she had in mind. She told him about Martha Greer in Fredericksburg and the distribution network that might, if the conversation went well, provide an alternative revenue stream that didn't depend on the coastal shipping routes that had already proven unreliable. Gideon Lancaster listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't correct her. He looked at the figures she pointed to, and he looked at the letters she'd drafted, and somewhere in the middle of it all, his expression shifted from raw and frightened to something more complicated. Something that had the beginning of respect in it, but also something harder to name in awareness. Maybe that he was being shown a version of himself he hadn't known existed. The version that had married someone smarter than he'd accounted for. When she finished, the room was very quiet. "The Philadelphia contact," he said. "You think he'll respond favorably?" "I think he'll respond," Isabella said. "He's a practical man. If the terms are sound, he'll consider it." "And the Greer woman?" She mentioned the distribution gap herself 18 months ago. "People don't forget a problem that's costing them money. I think she'll be interested in a conversation." Gideon looked at the ledger. He rubbed a hand over his face, a gesture she'd never seen him make before, unguarded and tired, and he said, "I should have told you." Isabella looked at him steadily. "Yes, you should have." "I didn't think—" He stopped, started again. "When we agreed to this arrangement, I didn't think you'd be—" "A person," Isabella said, quiet, not unkind, but precise. He flinched. She hadn't expected that. The flinch was small and quickly controlled, but it was there. "Someone with the capacity to help," he said. "That's a more generous interpretation of what you thought," Isabella said. "But I'll accept it." She closed the ledger. "We need to present a unified front before the end of the month. The Hargrove house needs to hear that the estate has a plan and a capable management team behind it. Edmund Ashworth already knows there are rumors circulating. Lady Margaret made sure of that this week, which means half the county knows it too. Margaret came here. On Tuesday, she came to see whether I was panicking." Isabella looked at him levelly. "I wasn't." Something moved across Gideon's face. Something that might have been had she been a different woman. A more charitable woman, or perhaps just a woman who hadn't heard a stranger's laughter through a closed door on her wedding night, something she could have called admiration. "What do you need from me?" he asked. The question hit her differently than she'd expected, because it was the first time he had asked her that. The first time in 2 months of marriage that Gideon Lancaster had offered not a directive, not a correction, not a careful territorial boundary, but a question with her name implied at the center of it. She kept her voice even. "Your cooperation and your signature. I can manage the conversations, but the letters need to come from Lancaster Manor, not from me individually. The creditors need to see that the estate is stable and its leadership is unified." "You have it," he said. "Good." She stood. "There's one more thing." He looked up. "Cicely Vane," Isabella said. Her voice did not waver. "Whatever that arrangement is, it needs to be concluded. Not for my sake, not primarily, but because if we are asking creditors and business partners to trust the stability of this household, we cannot afford the kind of social exposure that arrangement creates. People talk, Gideon. You know that better than anyone." The silence that followed was long and heavy. "You're not asking this because you're hurt," he said slowly. "I'm asking it because it's a liability," Isabella said. "Whatever else it is your business. But this estate is my business now too, and I'm not going to watch us lose it over something that could be quietly resolved." Gideon stood. He looked at her for a long moment. Really looked at her the way she wasn't sure he'd ever done before, without the calculating distance he wore like a coat. "I'll handle it," he said. "Thank you," she said, and turned back to her papers because the conversation was over and there was still work to be done. She heard him leave. She heard his footsteps down the corridor. She sat down at her desk and pressed her hands flat on the surface and breathed once, twice, until the shaking in her chest, the shaking she had not allowed anywhere near her face or her voice, settled back down into something manageable. She was not made of marble. She just knew when to be. Chishug. The letter from Philadelphia came in 9 days. It came on a Monday morning when Isabella was eating breakfast alone. Gideon had ridden out early to the southern boundary. Some question about a property line that Webb had flagged, and Mary brought it in with the post. And Isabella recognized the handwriting on the envelope and set down her fork. Her cousin's husband wrote 3 paragraphs. The first was pleasantries. The second was the information she'd asked for. The third was an offer. He knew a merchant house. Not in Baltimore, in Charleston, which was better because the Charleston routes ran differently and weren't subject to the same congestion that had been strangling the Baltimore contracts. The house was well capitalized and actively looking to expand its Virginia presence. They were willing to have a conversation. In fact, they were willing to send a representative north within the fortnight if the Lancaster estate was interested in a meeting. If the Lancaster estate was interested. Isabella read the letter twice and then sat very still for a moment with it in her hands, feeling something she hadn't felt since before the wedding, a kind of electric clarity, the particular sensation of a plan coming together. The way plans only come together when you have been patient and precise and refuse to panic when everything around you was suggesting that panic was the appropriate response. She was still sitting there when Gideon came back from the south boundary. He came into the dining room and stopped when he saw her expression. "What happened?" he said. She held up the letter. He crossed the room and took it. He read it. She watched his face as he read, watched the careful guard of it shift fracture slightly, and then reassemble into something more open than she'd seen before. "Charleston," he said. "Charleston," she said. "Better routes, better terms, and an established house with the capital to honor a long contract." He set the letter down. He looked at her. "You did this in 9 days." "I wrote the letter 12 days ago," she said. The 9 days was them. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, which was not something he usually did at breakfast when it wasn't the time he usually came to breakfast, and he looked at her with that unguarded expression again. The one she was starting to recognize, the one that meant he was out of the scripted version of himself and wasn't sure what came next. "What do you want out of this marriage?" he asked. And the question was not tactical, it was not strategic. It was just a question. A genuine one asked by a man who was only now beginning to understand that he hadn't actually thought to ask it before. Isabella looked at him for a moment. "I want the estate to be solvent," she said. "I want the tenants to be properly supported. I want to be treated as a partner in the management of what is by law and by agreement as much mine as it is yours." She paused. "And I want you to stop treating this marriage like a formality you're managing around." He was quiet for a long moment. "I haven't been kind," he said. "No," she agreed. "You haven't." "I didn't think—" He stopped again. He had a habit of stopping, she'd noticed, of starting sentences that led him somewhere he hadn't intended to go, and then catching himself. She wondered how long he'd been doing that. How many sentences he'd started and swallowed over the years. "You didn't think it mattered?" she said. Not harshly, just clearly. "I thought I was being practical," he said. "You were being careless," Isabella said. "Practical would have meant treating your business partner with professional respect from the beginning. What you were doing was something else." He didn't argue with that, which told her something. "The Charleston meeting," she said, pulling the conversation back to solid ground, because she needed solid ground right now, and she suspected he did too. "I'd like to be present, not in the background at the table." He looked at her. She held his gaze and didn't soften it. "All right," he said. "And I'd like to write the preliminary terms for the conversation. You can review them and revise, but I want to draft the starting position." Another pause, but shorter than the ones before. "All right," he said again. Isabella nodded. She reached for her tea. The morning was already going warm, the kind of dense Virginia summer heat that settled in early and didn't lift until well after dark, and she felt it on her arms and at the back of her neck, and she thought, this is what it feels like when something shifts. Not a dramatic crash, not a single enormous moment. Just a quiet pivot almost too small to name that changes the direction of everything that follows. She did not know yet what direction that was, but she was going to be the one navigating it. She was still thinking that, turning it over with a kind of steady, clear-eyed resolve, when Mrs. Caldwell appeared in the doorway of the dining room, with her hands folded and her expression carrying the particular weight of news that is not going to improve with waiting. "Mrs. Lancaster," she said. "There's someone at the door." "Who is it?" Mrs. Caldwell's eyes moved briefly to Gideon and then back to Isabella. "Miss Vane, ma'am. She's asking to speak with Mr. Lancaster." The dining room went very still. Isabella set down her teacup with a small, precise click. She did not look at Gideon. She kept her eyes on Mrs. Caldwell. She kept her voice completely level. "Tell Miss Vane," she said, "that Mr. Lancaster is in a meeting and is unavailable this morning." She picked up the Philadelphia letter and held it out to Gideon without looking at him. "We have correspondence to draft." The silence lasted exactly 4 seconds. Then Gideon took the letter from her hand. "Tell her," he said to Mrs. Caldwell, and his voice was quiet and final in a way that Isabella hadn't heard from him before, "that I am not available today, or any other day." Mrs. Caldwell nodded once. She withdrew. The dining room was quiet again. The summer heat pressed in at the windows. Somewhere on the estate a horse called out and was answered. Isabella looked at Gideon then, and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything for a moment, because the moment didn't need words. It was complete without them, weighted and clear, and impossible to mistake for anything other than what it was. A line crossed, not the line she'd hoped to cross 8 weeks ago, standing outside a closed door with her hand pressed flat against the wood. Not that particular wound healed over wounds like that didn't heal over in a morning over tea. But something. A different kind of line. The kind that gets crossed not when a man stops doing wrong, but when he makes a choice that costs him something. Isabella turned back to her papers. "The draft should open with the current revenue figures," she said, and moved directly to the proposed terms. "Don't lead with the financial difficulty, lead with the opportunity." "Agreed," Gideon said, and pulled his chair closer to the table. They worked for the rest of the morning in near silence. The two of them bent over the same papers, building something out of the wreckage of what this marriage had been. And if it wasn't love, it wasn't anywhere close to love. Yet might never be. She was clear-eyed enough about that. It was something that might in time become something she could live inside without losing herself. That was not nothing. That was in fact everything she'd come here for. The Charleston representative arrived on a Wednesday, which was not the day they had expected him. His name was Mr. Samuel Birch, and he rode up to Lancaster Manor on a bay horse with a leather satchel across his back and the brisk assessing manner of a man who had made his fortune by reading people and situations faster than they could arrange themselves to be read. He was perhaps 45, compact and sharp-eyed, and he took in the main house and the grounds, and Mr. Webb hovering at the gate with a single sweeping look before dismounting. Isabella was ready for him. She had been ready since Monday. Gideon had suggested gently, carefully in the new register they'd been finding their way toward over the past 2 weeks, that perhaps it would be better if he opened the meeting alone. Not because he doubted her. He said that specifically. Not because he doubted her, but because Charleston merchants were a particular breed, and some of them held particular opinions about. He'd searched for a diplomatic word. About women in business meetings, Isabella had supplied. "Yes. And your recommendation is that I hide in the hallway." He'd had the self-awareness to look slightly pained. "My recommendation is that I assess where he stands before we—" "No," Isabella had said pleasantly and without heat. "We agreed I would be at the table. That agreement stands. If Mr. Birch has objections, we'll learn something useful about whether we want to do business with him." Gideon had not argued further. He had also, she noticed, not looked displeased. So she was at the table when Samuel Birch was shown into the study. She sat to Gideon's left, with the preliminary terms she'd drafted laid neatly before her, and she watched Birch's eyes register her presence, assess it, and make a decision about it all in the space of about 2 seconds. He sat down. He looked at Gideon. He looked at Isabella. He looked at the papers in front of her. "Mrs. Lancaster," he said, "I was told you'd been instrumental in arranging this conversation." "I wrote the letter," she said. "My husband and I drafted the proposal together." Birch nodded slowly. Something in him had shifted. She couldn't name it precisely, but it had the quality of a man revising his expectations upward rather than down. "Then let's get to it," he said. "I've got a boat to catch in Richmond by Saturday." They talked for 3 hours. Isabella had done her preparation the way she did everything completely methodically, and without leaving a gap she hadn't accounted for. She knew the Charleston routes, the current shipping rates, the competing contracts that Birch's house was likely weighing against theirs. She knew what they needed, and she knew what they could offer, and she had structured the opening terms precisely at the point where the deal was attractive enough to be interesting, but not so favorable to the other side that it left the estate vulnerable. Birch was good. He pushed. He probed the financial details with the delicate precision of a man who does it for a living, and twice he found places in the numbers that made him lean forward, moments where Isabella could see him calculating whether he'd found a weakness he could use. Both times she answered before Gideon could. Both times she had the answer. By the second hour, Birch had stopped directing his questions to Gideon. By the third hour, he was looking at Isabella the way people look at someone they had not expected to encounter and are not quite sure what to do with a look she was thoroughly familiar with and which she found at this point in her life more satisfying than unsettling. When they broke, Birch stood and stretched and said to Gideon with the directness of a man who respects directness in others, "Your wife negotiates like a merchant Lancaster. Where'd she learn that?" "From my father's failures," Isabella said. "They were very educational." Birch laughed a real laugh, quick and appreciative. "I'll have revised terms to you by end of week," he said. "I think we can do business." He left. His horse was brought around. The sound of hooves faded down the long drive. Gideon and Isabella stood in the entrance hall, and the house was very quiet, and he looked at her with the expression she had come to think of as the real one. The one under all the armor. The one that had been appearing more and more often over the past 2 weeks, unguarded and a little undone. "You knew he was going to push on the third quarter projections," he said. "I knew someone was going to push on them. They're the obvious soft spot." She gathered her papers. "I prepared for it." "You prepared for everything." "I try to." She started for the stairs, then paused. "You let me lead. In there. After the first 20 minutes you let me carry it." "You were doing it better than I was," he said simply. She looked at him. He met her eyes and did not look away, and she thought that just cost him something. That admission right there, it cost a man like him something real. She understood the value of it. She did not make it smaller by saying so. "The revised terms will likely include a request for a delivery guarantee," she said instead. "We should discuss how to structure that before they arrive." "Tonight?" he asked. She paused. "If you like." "After supper," he said. "I'll have Mrs. Caldwell set the table in the small dining room." It was the first time he had suggested sharing a meal that wasn't either a formal obligation or a breakfast caught in passing. Isabella recognized it for what it was, not a grand gesture. Just a small course correction. The kind that changes direction by degrees, rather than all at once. "All right," she said. "After supper." The news about the Charleston meeting spread the way. All news in a county like this one spread faster than anyone had intended, and slightly garbled in the retelling. By Thursday, the version that had reached Edmund Ashworth was that Gideon Lancaster had secured a major new shipping contract through his wife's connections, which was accurate enough. By Friday, the version that had reached Lady Margaret Crane was that Isabella Hartley Lancaster had personally negotiated the deal and had left the Charleston merchant thoroughly impressed, which was close enough to the truth that Isabella didn't bother correcting it. Lady Margaret came to call on Saturday. It was a shorter visit than the previous ones. The basket of preserves was absent. The elaborate sympathy was absent. What was present was something Isabella hadn't seen on Lady Margaret's face before a very precisely calibrated reassessment conducted behind a social smile that was working harder than usual. "I hear the meeting went well," Lady Margaret said. "Very well," Isabella agreed. "Gideon must be pleased. We both are." Isabella poured the tea with the unhurried ease of a woman who is exactly where she intends to be. "The estate's shipping interests are going to look very different by the new year. There are some exciting opportunities in the Charleston routes that haven't been properly developed until now." "Is that so?" Lady Margaret turned her teacup in its saucer. "You've been busy." "I have. Most women," Lady Margaret said carefully, "in your position coming into an established household, learning the social landscape, most women would spend their first year simply finding their footing. I don't have that kind of time," Isabella said pleasantly. "And frankly, I don't have that kind of temperament either." She looked at Lady Margaret directly, the way she'd been doing since the beginning, without aggression, but without apology. "I came into this marriage with the intention of being useful to it. That's what I've been doing." Lady Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, and this was the most honest thing she'd said across any of their conversations, "Gideon Lancaster has never been an easy man to stand beside." "No," Isabella agreed. "He hasn't. And yet you're standing." "I'm not standing beside him," Isabella said. "I'm standing with him. There's a difference." She picked up her cup. "I think that distinction matters to both of us." Lady Margaret looked at her for a long moment, with an expression that had moved past calculation entirely, and arrived at something that was not quite respect, but perhaps its waiting room. "You're going to be very good at this," she said. "I intend to be," Isabella said. Lady Margaret left 20 minutes later, and this time when Isabella watched the carriage go, Mrs. Caldwell appeared at her shoulder and said, "She'll stop coming to look for weakness." "I know," Isabella said. "She'll start coming because she actually wants to." She turned from the window. "Which is more useful anyway?" Mrs. Caldwell made the small, almost smile that was as close as she usually got. "Your predecessor would have liked you," she said. "I hope so," Isabella said, and meant it. The letter that arrived on Tuesday morning was not the Charleston revised terms. It was something else entirely, and when Isabella read it, she had to read it twice before she was fully certain of what she was looking at. It was from her father. He wrote that he had received word through a mutual contact. He didn't specify who, that there were questions being raised in certain circles about the legitimacy of the original Lancaster estate transactions. Specifically about a parcel of land on the estate's northern boundary that had been purchased from a family named Graves some 15 years prior, and which the surviving Graves heirs were now claiming had been acquired under terms that were not entirely fair. He wrote it gently, her father, the way he always wrote things he knew would be difficult. He buried it in pleasantries and asked about her health and the Virginia summer, and whether she was eating well, and then, in the fourth paragraph, almost in passing, he mentioned the Graves family. Isabella set the letter down. She picked it up again. She read the fourth paragraph 3 more times. Then she went to find Gideon. He was in his study, which was no longer a room she needed permission to enter. That boundary had dissolved somewhere in the second week of their working together quietly and without ceremony, the way most real things dissolved when they weren't being useful anymore. She closed the door behind her and put the letter on his desk. He read it. She watched the change move across his face. Not surprise exactly. Something more like the particular grimace of a man who has been expecting a certain consequence to arrive and has been hoping it would hold off just a little longer. "You knew," she said. Not an accusation. A statement. He looked up at her. "I knew there were questions about the original acquisition, Gideon." She said his name the way you say a word when you need someone to understand you mean it. "Tell me what actually happened with the Graves land." He was quiet for a moment. Then he closed the letter and set it down and said, "My father bought that parcel in 1799. The Graves patriarch was in debt. Significant debt. My father offered a price that covered the debt, but left the family very little. There was a son who was a minor at the time. He's been making noise for 2 years. I thought it would come to nothing. And now he's apparently found someone willing to help him make it formal. Isabella sat down in the chair across from the desk, his chair when he was on her side of the room. She thought about this. She thought about the Hargrove creditors, and the Charleston contract, and the tenant seed supplies, and every other weight she'd been quietly redistributing over the past 3 months. And she thought one more thing. Fine. One more thing. What is the son's name? Daniel Graves. He's about 30 now, lives in Charlottesville. Is his claim legitimate? Gideon paused. It's arguable. The price my father paid was legal. Whether it was just is a different question. Those two things matter differently in a court of law versus a county social landscape, Isabella said. Which arena are we actually worried about? He looked at her. Both. She nodded slowly. Then we need to address both separately. She leaned forward. The legal question: do we have a lawyer we trust? James Whitfield in Fredericksburg. Write to him today. We need his honest assessment of the claim's viability, not an optimistic one. The social question. She paused. How bad is the story if it becomes public? Bad enough, Gideon said. My father was not a gentleman in business. People know that. If the Graves story spreads with the right framing, it confirms a narrative that... He stopped. That the Lancaster wealth was built on other people's desperation, Isabella said quietly. He didn't deny it. She sat with that for a moment. Not judging it, she didn't have the luxury of judging things that couldn't be changed, and the past was the one category of problem that no amount of competence could touch directly. But she thought about it. She thought about Thomas Holloway's handwritten note in her cedar box. She thought about Mr. Webb's face when he'd turned the ledger toward her. She thought about what it meant to build something solid on a foundation that had cracks in it. Is Daniel Graves a reasonable man? She asked. I don't know him. Find out, she said. Before the lawyers get fully involved. Before this becomes adversarial. She looked at Gideon steadily. If there's a way to settle this that acknowledges the original wrong without destroying the estate, that's the path worth taking. Not because it's legally required, because it's right, and because the right thing and the strategically sound thing happen to be the same thing in this case. Gideon looked at her for a long moment. You're suggesting we approach him, he said. I'm suggesting we consider whether approaching him with an honest acknowledgement and a fair offer resolves this better than fighting a legal battle that will draw exactly the kind of attention we cannot afford right now. And if he's not interested in settlement, then we fight, Isabella said. But we try first. He was quiet. She could see him working through it, not resisting exactly, but adjusting. Recalibrating. She was learning the rhythm of his thinking, the way you learn the rhythm of any work you do alongside someone long enough. The pauses that meant he was genuinely processing something versus the pauses that meant he was managing his response. This was the first kind. All right, he said, write to Whitfield for the legal assessment. I'll make inquiries about Graves. Good. She stood. Then, because something had been sitting at the back of her mind since he'd said what he'd said about his father. Gideon. The tenant issues. The seed supplies, the well repairs, the maintenance requests that went unanswered. Were those decisions, or were they oversights? He held her gaze. He could have been evasive. She watched him choose not to be. Decisions, he said. Ones I'm not proud of in retrospect. Thank you for telling me that, she said. She walked to the door. Isabella. She turned. He looked at her with the unguarded expression, fully unguarded. Now no armor, no performance, nothing between his face and whatever he was actually feeling. It was the most she'd seen of him. It struck her somewhere below the practical thinking and the strategic planning somewhere she didn't entirely have language for. I don't know how to do this, he said. And she understood that this did not mean the estate or the creditors or the Graves situation. This meant the two of them. The thing they were building in the space between all the practical arrangements. I'm not good at it. I know, she said. Neither am I particularly. She held his gaze. But I think we're both better at hard things than we are at giving up. So that's probably where we start. She left him with that and went to write the letter to James Whitfield. And she was halfway through the first paragraph when she realized that her hands were entirely steady. Not because she wasn't affected by what had just passed between them in that study, she was more than she'd expected, but because she had figured out somewhere in the past 3 months how to be affected by something and still keep moving. That she thought might be the most useful thing she'd ever learned. The inquiry about Daniel Graves came back in 5 days through a contact of Gideon's in Charlottesville, who knew the Graves family by reputation. What came back was not what either of them had expected. Daniel Graves was not a bitter man nursing a grudge. He was a schoolteacher. He had a wife and 2 young children. He lived modestly, taught history and arithmetic to the children of Charlottesville's middle class, and had spent the last 2 years not trying to destroy the Lancaster estate, but simply trying to recover enough to buy back a small piece of what his family had lost, enough land to leave his own children something of their grandfather's legacy. He wasn't after a legal battle. He was after acknowledgement. When Isabella read the report, she set it down and was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "We're inviting him here." Gideon looked up from across the desk. Here. Here, to the estate, to see it, to sit at a table with us and have a real conversation. She looked at him steadily. His family's land is part of what became our northern pasture. We offer him a fair price for a 2-acre parcel fair by current standards, not 1799 standards. We acknowledge directly and in writing that the original acquisition price was below the land's value, and we give his children something to inherit. Gideon was very still. "That will cost us," he said. "Yes," Isabella said. "It will cost us money we don't easily have right now, and it will cost you something harder than money." She held his gaze. "But the Charleston contract is coming. The estate's income will improve. And when we do this, when people in this county hear that Gideon Lancaster looked back at what his father did and chose to make it right, that story will travel further and do more good than any shipping contract." He was quiet for a long time, longer than usual. She did not rush him. "It was my father's decision," he said finally, not as an excuse, as a fact he was examining. "Yes," she said, "and you inherited the estate that benefited from it. That's not the same as making the decision yourself, but it's not nothing either." Another silence. Then, write to Graves. She wrote the letter that afternoon. She wrote it carefully, directly, without legal hedging or performative humility. She stated plainly that the Lancaster estate wished to acknowledge the inadequacy of the original purchase terms, and that Gideon Lancaster and his wife wished to extend an invitation to discuss a remedy that might honor what the Graves family had lost. She asked if he would come. She sealed the letter and handed it to the postwriter and stood in the drive watching it go, and she thought about the cedar box on her writing desk with Thomas Holloway's note inside it. She thought about small things and what they built when you stacked them carefully enough. 3 days later, Daniel Graves wrote back. He would come. He wrote one other line below his signature in slightly uneven script, the script of a man not accustomed to writing letters that carried this much weight. "My father always said the land itself was never the real loss. The real loss was that no one ever looked us in the eye and said we deserved better. I'll come." Isabella read that line standing in the entrance hall, and she felt something open in her chest that she hadn't known was closed. Something she could not have named before this moment, and still couldn't name precisely, except that it felt like the difference between building something and building something that was worth building. She folded the letter carefully. She put it in the cedar box next to Thomas Holloway's note. Then she went to tell Gideon that Daniel Graves was coming, and she walked through the house with her shoulders level and her step even. And if Lancaster Manor felt different under her feet than it had on the morning she'd first arrived in her cream silk dress, if it felt less like a prize she'd been purchased to adorn, and more like a place she had chosen and was choosing, and would keep choosing, she knew better than to say so out loud before the choosing was done. She was not finished yet, not by a long way. But she was not anywhere close to where she'd started either. And that Isabella Hartley Lancaster thought walking through her house in the heavy gold heat of a Virginia summer afternoon was exactly the kind of progress worth protecting with everything she had. Daniel Graves arrived on a Thursday morning in late August when the summer had peaked and was just beginning to show the first faint signs of releasing its grip. Not cooler yet, but tired, the way heat gets tired before it finally breaks. He came alone on a modest brown horse with a coat that was clean and carefully pressed, and a face that carried the particular dignity of a man who has learned to hold his head level, regardless of what room he's walking into. He was younger looking than Isabella had expected. 30, the report had said, but he had the kind of face that held its youth open, watchful, not yet armored. He dismounted and stood in the drive, and he looked at Lancaster Manor the way a person looks at a place that has lived in their imagination long enough to feel real before they've ever seen it in person. Not with bitterness exactly, with something more complicated. Recognition, maybe. The acknowledgement of something that had always been there in the background of his life, shaping it without his permission. Isabella went out to meet him. She did not send a footman. She did not wait for him to be brought to a parlor. She walked out to the drive herself, and she extended her hand and she said, "Mr. Graves, thank you for coming." He shook her hand and looked at her with an expression that was cautious, but not closed. "Mrs. Lancaster." He glanced past her at the house. "It's larger than I imagined." "It usually is," she said. "Come inside. Gideon is waiting." She had thought carefully about the staging of this meeting, not in a calculating way, but in the way she thought about everything: who should be where, what the room should feel like, what the conversation needed in order to go where it needed to go. She had chosen the small dining room rather than the formal parlor because the formal parlor was about status and the small dining room was about people. She had asked Mrs. Caldwell to have coffee rather than tea because she'd learned from the Charlottesville report that Daniel Graves's family was not the tea-drinking kind. Small things, they mattered. Gideon was standing when they entered, which was not a thing he did automatically for guests of lower social standing, and which therefore cost him something visible, and which therefore meant something. Daniel Graves noticed. His expression shifted slightly. "Mr. Lancaster," he said. "Mr. Graves." Gideon did not offer a prepared speech. He had said to Isabella the night before that he didn't know what to say, and she had told him to start with the truth and then stop talking, and he had to his credit taken that advice. "I appreciate you making the journey." They sat down. For the first 10 minutes, no one said anything that mattered. Coffee was poured. Pleasantries were exchanged with the careful tentativeness of people navigating unfamiliar terrain. And then Gideon put down his cup and said, "I want to speak to you plainly, if that's acceptable." Daniel Graves looked at him steadily. "That's why I came. My father bought your family's land in 1799 for a price that reflected your grandfather's debt and nothing else. The land was worth more. He knew that. He bought it anyway." Gideon paused. "I can't undo that. I can't give back the years your family spent without it. But I can tell you directly that it was wrong, and I can ask what would be meaningful to you now." The room was very quiet. Daniel Graves looked at the table for a long moment. When he looked up, his eyes were steady, but something in them had shifted a tension he'd been carrying for 2 years, Isabella thought. Maybe longer. Maybe his whole life. "My grandfather built the farmhouse on that north parcel with his own hands," he said. "He planted the first orchard the year my father was born. When we lost the land, we lost all of that. The house is gone. I know that I'm not asking for the house." He paused. "But the orchard, the old apple trees, are they still there?" Gideon looked at Isabella briefly. She gave him the smallest nod. "They are," Gideon said. Daniel Graves breathed out slowly. "Then what I want," he said, "is 2 acres around those trees sold back to me at a fair price. Not charity, a fair price one I can earn toward over time, and a written acknowledgement signed by both of you that the original acquisition was not conducted justly." He looked at them steadily. "I don't want to destroy this estate. I want my children to know that their great-grandfather's name wasn't erased without anyone noticing." Isabella reached into the folder on the table beside her and slid a document across to him. He looked down at it. He read it carefully. She could see his lips moving slightly, the careful attention of a schoolteacher who read everything precisely. When he finished, he looked up. "You wrote this before I told you what I wanted," he said. "I had a sense," Isabella said. He read it again. The document acknowledged the inadequacy of the original purchase terms, proposed the 2-acre return at current assessed value with a structured payment arrangement, and was signed at the bottom by both Isabella and Gideon Lancaster. Her name was first. That had been her decision, and Gideon had not questioned it. Daniel Graves set the document down. He looked at Isabella with an expression she recognized, the same expression Thomas Holloway had given her the first time she rode out to the eastern boundary farms. The same expression Mr. Webb had worn when he'd turned the ledger toward her. The expression of someone who has been waiting to be surprised by someone from the main house, and has finally unexpectedly been surprised in the right direction. "My father told me," he said quietly, "that the worst part wasn't losing the land. The worst part was that nobody from this house ever looked at us like we were people worth considering." He looked at Isabella. "You're not what I expected to find here." "I hear that fairly often," Isabella said. "I've stopped taking it as a compliment and started taking it as a challenge." Daniel Graves smiled. It changed his whole face. "I'll sign," he said. The paperwork was completed before noon. James Whitfield, the estate's lawyer, had sent a representative to witness and formalize the documents, and by the time Daniel Graves rode back down the long drive, the Graves land matter was resolved in writing in law, and more importantly, in the county's social awareness, because Mr. Whitfield's representative was the kind of man who talked, and the kind of talking he did was the kind that traveled. By the following Tuesday, Edmund Ashworth had heard. By Wednesday, it had reached half the county's drawing rooms. By Thursday, Constance Ashworth sent a note to Isabella personally with a pressed flower from her garden and 3 lines of handwriting that said, "What you and Gideon have done with the Graves matter is the right thing. I wanted you to know that someone noticed." Isabella put the note in the cedar box. The box was getting full. The Charleston revised terms arrived that same week, and they were good. Better than good, they were the kind of terms that represented a genuine shift in the estate's financial landscape, not a stopgap, but a foundation. Samuel Birch had gone back to his partners and restructured the proposal in a way that extended the contract to 5 years, with an option to renew, which meant stability of income across a horizon long enough to plan against. The Hargrove debt in Baltimore could be addressed in full by November. The overlapping creditor schedules that had been Mr. Webb's private nightmare could be unwound in an orderly way. Gideon read the terms and set them down on Isabella's desk with the careful look of a man who is holding something very good and is slightly afraid to believe in it. "Is this real?" he said. "It's real," she said. "Sign it." He signed it. She countersigned because the new arrangement with Birch's house recognized both Lancaster principles, which had been her condition, and which Birch had accepted without argument, which had told her everything she needed to know about Samuel Birch's actual opinion of who had driven that negotiation. Gideon pushed the signed documents back across the desk toward her and then didn't move. He sat there looking at her with that open, unguarded expression, the real one, the one she'd been watching emerge over 3 months, like something that had always been there under the surface, waiting for the right conditions. "When you first arrived here," he said, "I told you to stay out of the study. You did. I had an inventory of everything in this house that I considered mine to manage alone." He paused. "You didn't stay out of any of it." "No," she agreed. "I didn't." "Isabella." He said her name with a weight she hadn't heard in it before. Not the careful, managed tone of a man maintaining appropriate distance. Something else. Something that was trying to cross a line it wasn't entirely sure it was permitted to cross. "I owe you an honest accounting." She waited. "I married you because your family's tobacco lands fit a financial gap in the estate's collateral structure," he said. "That was the entirety of my calculation. I did not consider who you were, what you were capable of, whether the arrangement I was making was something a reasonable person could actually live inside." He looked at her steadily. That was careless and unkind. And I've known it since approximately the third week of your residence here. And I haven't said so because I am not practiced at saying things like that. The afternoon was very still around them. You're saying it now, Isabella said. Yes. Why now? He considered the question with the seriousness he gave to things that actually mattered to him. Because the Graves meeting this morning was the first time I watched someone do the right thing and understood that I was only in the room because of them. He paused. The letter to Graves was your idea. The framing was yours. Even the coffee instead of tea was yours, wasn't it? He doesn't seem like a tea drinker, Isabella said. Something moved across Gideon's face. Something between exasperation and something much warmer. You think about people, he said. The way they actually are, not the way it's convenient for them to be. I am not accustomed to that. I find it... He stopped. Inconvenient, she supplied. Remarkable, he said. The word landed in the room and stayed there uncomplicated by anything else. Isabella looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the wedding night and the closed door and the hand pressed flat against cold plaster. She thought about the list she'd made at her writing desk in the small hours, the practical list, the one without sentiment in it. She thought about all the work she'd done since then, the tenants and the ledgers, and the Ashworth dinner and the Charleston negotiation, all the weight she'd picked up and carried and refused to put down, not because anyone told her she had to carry it, but because she had decided this house and these people and this life deserved someone who would. Gideon, she said. I didn't come into this marriage expecting love. I came expecting a functional arrangement and a degree of basic respect. You gave me neither of those things at the start. She held his gaze without softening it. We're not at the beginning anymore. I know that. But I need you to understand something clearly. Tell me, he said. I am not going to be grateful to you for finally treating me as a partner, she said. That was always the minimum. What I will be, what I think I might already be if I'm honest, is glad to build something with you. If you mean it. Not because you've recalculated the value of what I bring to this arrangement, but because you actually see me. He held her gaze. He did not look away. He did not reach for a diplomatic qualification or a careful middle ground. I see you, he said. I have been seeing you for some time. I didn't know what to do with it. You could start, Isabella said, by passing the Birch contract to Mr. Webb and asking him to file it. And then you could have supper with me tonight, a real one, not the estate business kind. He stood. He picked up the contract. He looked at her with the expression that was finally fully unmistakably the real one. And it was not polished, and it was not strategic, and it was not the face of a man managing a transaction. It was the face of a person standing at the beginning of something he hadn't known he was going to want. I'll tell Mrs. Caldwell, he said. Good, Isabella said, and turned back to her papers because there was still work to do, and she was not the kind of woman who stopped working just because the hardest part was over. The supper that evening was the first one that felt like neither an obligation nor a negotiation. They talked about things that had nothing to do with creditors, or contracts, or county politics. He told her about the summer he was 12, and followed the estate's old head groom across 3 counties tracking a stolen horse, and how that summer had been the last time he'd felt entirely free of expectation. She told him about her father's library, the books her mother had thought were unsuitable for a girl, and her father had quietly left on her bedside table, anyway, the ones about trade law, and agricultural management, and the history of the Virginia land grants. She told him what she'd understood, even at 14, that most people around her hadn't seemed to understand, that knowledge was the only thing no one could take from you once you had it. Gideon listened the way she'd wanted him to listen since the beginning, with his full attention, without reaching for something useful in it, just listening because she was talking and he wanted to hear. Your father sounds like a remarkable man, he said. He was afraid of too many things, Isabella said. But he loved me well. Those are different columns and they don't have to cancel each other out. Gideon looked at her across the table. "I was afraid of too many things too," he said. "I thought certainty was the same as strength. I built a version of this estate and this life that looked stable from the outside." He paused. "It wasn't." "No," she said. "It wasn't. But it is now." She picked up her glass. "Or it's getting there." He picked up his own. He held it toward her, not a formal toast, just an acknowledgement. The simplest possible kind, the kind that doesn't need words to be understood. She met it. September brought the first cool morning. Isabella felt it when she opened the window of her office before dawn, just a thread of it in the air, thin as a promise but real. The summer was releasing. The season was changing. She had been in Lancaster Manor for 14 weeks. 14 weeks since she'd stood at that altar in cream silk and looked at the back of a man's head while he finished a sentence about business, before he turned to acknowledge his bride. 14 weeks since the closed door, and the laughter, and the cold plaster wall, and the list she'd written at 3 a.m. by candlelight. She took the cedar box from her desk and opened it. Thomas Holloway's note. Daniel Graves's letter, the one with the line about his grandfather's name. Constance Ashworth's pressed flower. The signed Charleston contract, a copy of it, she'd kept a copy for the box. The first page of the Graves settlement document. Several other notes and letters, and small acknowledgments she hadn't consciously been saving until she noticed she was saving them. At the very bottom of the box, the original list. The practical list written in careful small letters in the last hours of her wedding night. Access the estate ledgers. Find allies. Understand the financial position. Move carefully. She looked at it for a long time. Then she folded it once and put it back in the box and closed the lid. There was a knock at her office door. "Come in," she said. It was Gideon. He had his coat on and his hat in his hand, which was the posture he used when he was going somewhere and wanted to know if she was coming. She recognized it now. She recognized a great many things now. "Webb says the north pasture fence needs assessment before the autumn," he said. "I thought we might ride out together." She looked at him. He was standing in the doorway of the office that had been the first territory she'd claimed in this house, and he was standing there, the way you stand in a place you've come to understand, belongs to someone else, and have decided to respect it. "Give me 5 minutes," she said. He nodded and withdrew. She heard him in the corridor, heard him stop to speak briefly with Mrs. Caldwell, something about the evening meal, and heard Mrs. Caldwell's response, which contained a warmth that had not been there in the early weeks. Warmth that had been built carefully and steadily by someone paying attention. Isabella stood and smoothed her riding dress and looked at the cedar box on the desk and thought about 14 weeks and what could be built in 14 weeks when you refused to be broken, when you kept your eyes open and your hands working and your mind clear, even when everything around you was designed by carelessness, if not by intent, to make you smaller than you were. She thought about the woman who had stood outside that closed door, pressing her hand against cold plaster, listening to proof that her dignity had been treated as disposable before she'd even unpacked her trunk. She thought about what that woman had done instead of weeping. What she'd chosen. What she'd built. Lancaster Manor was not the same house it had been in June. The tenants had their seed and their repaired wells, and a mistress who knew their names. The estate's finances had a structure, now a real one, not the fragile scaffolding of borrowed time. The county's social landscape had shifted in ways that would take months more to fully settle, but the direction was clear. And the man who had stood at an altar with his attention elsewhere had learned across 14 weeks of being shown what it looked like when someone gave their full attention to something they cared about. That attention was a choice, and that he was capable of making it. None of that had been given to her. She had made every inch of it herself. Isabella Hartley Lancaster picked up her riding gloves, walked out of her office, and went to find her husband. She moved through her house. Her house, every floorboard and every hallway, and every room with its particular smell of beeswax and old wood and Virginia summer fading into fall. She moved through it the way a woman moves through a place she has earned the right to inhabit. Not striding, not rushing, steadily. with full knowledge of where she was going and complete certainty of who she was when she got there. At the front door, Gideon was waiting. He handed her the reins of her horse without ceremony, the way you hand something to a person you trust with it, and they rode out together down the long, oak-lined drive toward the north pasture, under a sky that was the deep clear blue of early September, the color of a season that had finally decided to tell the truth. She had come into this marriage with almost nothing except her own mind and her own will, and she had turned that into everything. Not everything that was possible. Not yet. She was 24 years old, and she had 14 weeks of this life behind her, and years of it still ahead, and she was not a woman who mistook a battle won for a war finished. There would be more creditors and more Lady Margarets, and more closed doors behind which things happened that were not meant for her to know. There would be harder seasons than this one, and problems that didn't resolve as neatly as the Graves settlement or the Charleston contract. She knew all of that. She also knew that she would meet every single one of those things the way she had met the first and the worst. With her eyes open, her list made, and her spine straight. She would meet them as the woman she had decided to be on the night she could have been destroyed by what she heard through a door, and chose instead to go sit at her writing desk and think. That woman was not going anywhere. Isabella Lancaster rode toward the north pasture in the cool September morning, and the orchard was visible in the distance. The old apple trees that had been Daniel Graves's grandfathers, and were now returning slowly and rightly to where they belonged. And she thought, this is what it looks like when a woman refuses to be written out of her own story. This is exactly what it looks like, and no one, not a cold husband, not a